Hey there, and welcome to That News You Care About, a weekly video game news show from the folks over at That Nerdy Site. Today is Tuesday, February 22nd of 2022. 22s all around, twos everywhere. Everybody's excited about it today. I am one of your hosts, Logan Wilkinson, and joining me this week, as always, is my Phoenix son, Trevor Starkey.
Hello.
How you doing, Trev?
Doing good. Been playing lots of Horizon that we will be talking about for sure.
Yeah, funny you mentioned that. Yeah, we are doing a sort of what we've been playing recently episode. It's been a while since we've done one of those, and I always enjoy those conversations.
I mean, we usually have them on our other podcast, on our That Nerdy Site Show podcast, but you're on this one way more.
Trevor has been the man on the ground here for Horizon, and we will kind of go all through his Forbidden West thoughts. I will also be kind of going over Dying Light 2 and my discussions and thoughts over there, as well as having played through the James Bond video game Bloodstone.
The thing that all of our listeners are eger to find out about, a PS3 game from from the 20-somethings. As
a little companion piece to that Bond show, in the spirit to go play a James Bond video game, go figure, after you're just doing nothing but Bond podcast for 11 weeks. And they're in short supply. We will start, of course, though, with Forbidden West. Trevor, will go broad and kind of narrow it down. Just your general impressions early on with Forbidden West. How are you feeling?
So I've put, I looked it up right before we started recording. I've put 44 hours into Horizon Forbidden West so far.
Really?
Over the course of like a couple days, because I'm off from work and stuff like that. It is, I don't know how far through the game I am. I feel like I'm probably past the halfway point, maybe. Mm-hmm. There's definitely a lot more game to this one. And I'm really enjoying it. I'm having a great time kind of being back in this world, having fun with the combat of it. The characters that like carry over from the first game are fun, and Aloy, I think, goes out with them a little bit more. So like they are your Atreus or your Ellie kind of characters, right, this time around for parts of the game. There's still a lot of it that is just you roaming the post-apocalyptic wasteland on your own kind of thing. But for a lot of the story beats and some of the side quests and stuff, you have kind of new and old characters kind of like going out on these journeys with you. It's a lot of fun. There have been a few like really stellar standout moments that I've been like, oh, that is a thing I know I'm going to remember when I'm looking back on this game, cool. Years from now and stuff like that. And I don't want to like mention them because of spoilery stuff, but like, yeah, one of them yesterday, I just kind of like, I took like a minute video of me just kind of standing on top of a thing and just kind of doing that like E3 like slow spin around kind of thing, like, but yeah, the top of Assassin's Creed kind of thing. And I was like, oh man, I'm never gonna share this video because I don't want to spoil this like visual for people, but it is really cool. And yeah, I've just been having a ton of fun with that. I mentioned this to you yesterday when you were recording Bond, that between this and in particular Ghost of Tsushima, like PlayStation has found this kind of pattern right now where I think they are making Ubisoft games better than Ubisoft is, or at least games that speak to me more, that kind of fall in that like open world, go check off all the boxes kind of vibe that Ubisoft games so often go for, be it Assassin's Creed, be it Watch Dogs, be it Far Cry. And I'm just so much more invested in not only the worlds that we've gotten with these couple of PlayStation games, but also the minute to minute combat and action is just so much more fun and engaging than some of those others. And like, I don't hate the controls as much as I do some of those other games. So yeah, I've just been having a ton of fun with it so far. I will say, like, performance wise, I did have I've had one crash so far where it was like it took quite a while to like back up because apparently my save file had been corrupted somehow and it had to like repair it and restore it. And it's all good. I didn't like lose any progress or anything like that, but it for like the next day it was like, hey, we can't match up your file on the console with the file that we have in the cloud because the file on the console has been corrupted. Do you want to like reconcile these two? And I was like, oh, please don't break things, and like hit reconcile. Still good, but I have had that issue. And then there's this other thing that I've noticed, and I think it's just because this is such a giant world, and sometimes like you might travel somewhere where it didn't expect you to travel or something like that. So there will be occasional times where like the screen will go black for half a second and give you that like mini heart attack of like freezing or crashing or something like that. Right. And then like it comes back in, and it's like, I typically notice it when I am jumping off of a high thing with Aloy and like gliding down a far ways away, a la a Breath of the Wild kind of thing or something like that. And so like, I feel like it happens when I, reach past a certain point where it's like, shit, we got to load in some stuff. Give us a second. And it kind of like flutters and then comes back. And I wish there were a better way to handle that. Because it's a little more panic inducing when it's like, oh, everything went to black, as opposed to like, oh, the game slowed down for a little bit and is caught up or something like that. That is, I feel like, the normal situation that you get there. But other than that, like, it's a really impressive game and really pretty, and like I'm enjoying the story so far, and kind of the twists and turns. The game definitely has kind of like an intro tutorial thing, and then a like larger mini open world where it kind of like opens up the world to you, but you are going to be like barred at some point, a la like a Grand Theft Auto or something like that, where it's like, okay, you can't get past this point until you've reached a certain point in the story. And then once you've reached that certain point in the story, it opens up, significantly more. And it's a big, beautiful world that that has continued westward from the kind of the locale of the first game.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about it in the context of playing through Dying Light 2, which is obviously the kind of the big open world game I've been kind of going through, and looking at all of the amazing, beautiful screenshots and videos people have been sharing and taken online, and then looking at Dying Light 2, which I think has really beautiful moments at times. Again, we talked about it earlier, like a few weeks ago at this point, I guess, actually. Like kind of the opening section of Dying Light 2, where you are like looking out at a horizon when you get to like a house early on that you kind of watched in Cameron's Let's Play, I think is done really well. And then you look at like the character models and it's like, right, these are from 2014 still. Right, I got it. Okay, great. And like, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it is so striking to like put down my controller, open up Twitter and be like, oh wow, that is a human being in a video game, just straight up.
I will say that, like, it's. I think a lot of that stuff works better as screenshots versus, because there is definitely it's not quite as bad and herky jerky as Fallout 4 with like the character animations when you're like talking to a merchant and like having a conversation with them or something like that. But it is very much still shot in that like, kind of. And the original had that same feel exactly to it too, yeah. And I definitely think, and I saw somebody else tweet this out, but I don't remember who, so I can't kind of give them the credit for it. But they tweeted out something to the effect of, Guerrilla kind of course corrected from a lot of the criticisms of the first game of like everybody kind of looks very wooden and like still. And this time around, they are a lot more animated, sometimes like to an absurd degree. And there have been a couple times where a character's talking to me and I like, it feels like they're on a stage and breaking the fourth wall and trying to be as big as possible, and it's like you're 2 feet away from me in world, dude. Like, tone it down a little bit. And they're like big and grandiose gestures, and it's not that that's their character. It's just they are telling you about their quest and they're being extremely animated about it, kind of thing. And it's been funny, but it's also like there are elements where I'm like, I love it and just have great like a fun and admiration and joy to it.
It's actually really, I'm actually really glad we had this conversation, because the more I think about it, the more I do find Horizon Forbidden West and Dying Light 2 actually really good companion games kind of play at the same time, right? There are a lot of parallels in the two, and that is a feature that is very common in Dying Light 1 and 2, right? Is again this Fallout-esque, like, we're gonna just pan to the person talking, and yeah, like the performances there in Dying Light 2, I think, like you said, range from that is incredibly wooden to there are some that I cannot help but just laugh at, like, the nature of what this character is doing, or like where their head is looking while like having this really emotional beat, or the theatrical nature of it all. It is one of the things that I'm sure turns some people off, but is like one of those weird, like, it's a video game elements that I actually like secretly kind of love. It's just like, yeah, like it's a game and they're going to have goofy moments like that where like the person talking to you is not always going to do great in a Fallout or Horizon or Dying Light kind of style thing. But it's still like a funny, like, peek behind the curtain of like, oh, right, it's a video game I'm playing again. That can kind of get lost in like the moment to moment gameplay of it all. Yeah, I mean, do you have any, I guess, non-spoilery kind of favorite things you want to highlight, or particular strengths of the game that you want to take note of?
I mean, like it's tough to be like to do it in like a vague non-spoilery way.
Yeah.
I will say that like there is a point where you kind of like establish like a home base in the game,
Mm-hmm.
where I was like, oh, that's okay. Now I see the direction that this game is going, and it's it does that thing where it's like, okay, here are 3 main story objectives that you can do. You can do them in whatever order you want. We're going to give you kind of the, like, here's the levels for each of them. So it's like, if you want to kind of do it in like order, they're kind of giving you a gauge, but it's also like, oh, if you want to go and do this one first, go do this one first. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. I've done like 2 of those things so far, 2 of the 3. And then presumably there's going to be still some stuff kind of after that point. And both of those were like really fun and engaging, and just I mean, they're basically the big set pieces of the game compared to like the 90% of the rest of the game that you're doing that is just like going from place to place, kind of finding all the icons on the map, doing all the side quests and stuff like that, which is all fun as well. But like the main story stuff so far is like, oh, these are some of the real big showcases, and where they have some like really fun ideas in kind of the locations that they're playing around with, as well as like, again, the mythology of the world that has been set up, and the kind of the culture of the Forbidden West, seeing how that kind of became, and seeing how it is kind of like kind of evolved over time through kind of finding things in the game and little lore pieces and stuff like that. It's, you know, a lot of fun, just like it was kind of with the Nora and with the Karja and with the Oseram and with the Banuk tribes of kind of the first game, kind of getting to know the Uratu tribe and the Tanakh tribes of this one so far have been like a lot of fun. And then there's like, you know, a surprising big bad that kind of gets introduced. I'm like, oh, okay, that's who our kind of enemy is in this game. Interesting. Okay. And yeah, I'm having a good time with it. It's like, there's definitely an element of, there is a lot more to this game. And as somebody who does love games that are a bit more finely tuned, and you know, we always talk about like the God of War, you know, it's edited down very, very well. There probably could have been some editing on this. It'll be, you know, tough to gauge until I'm really done with the thing, but it is significantly a larger experience than the original one was. And I don't hate it. I haven't become burnt out on the game. Cause it's still very much like, go at your own pace. If you want to just mainline the story stuff, you can probably do that. You probably have to do a little bit of grinding and leveling up here and there to kind of
be strong enough, right?
Manage and stuff like that. But like if and there have been plenty of times where I'm like, okay, that's my next story thing. But I've picked up all these like, handful of side quests over in this part of the map that I haven't been to yet. Let me go over there and just kind of knock out a whole bunch of those things and like have some fun kind of exploring the world and seeing that. So yeah, like I'm really having a great time with it.
Any final thoughts on Horizon Forbidden West?
No, I don't think so. I will continue to kind of like report back when when I've gotten further. Hopefully I'll be able to continue putting in some more time tonight, and then I've got pretty much all day tomorrow too that I can do. So hopefully I'll knock it out by this weekend at the latest, and yeah, just having a great time with it.
Perfect. We love to hear it. That leads us to the pivot of Dying Light 2, right? Timestamp there. It's going to be a lot of a similar conversation, actually, in some ways, to the Horizon Forbidden West cover. And, like, it does make me kind of curious to see what your thoughts would be for Dying Light 2, obviously knowing your kind of apprehension for, like, horror games. But I do think there is a surprising amount of charm to it, right? Like, and maybe it's just being in the mood for kind of a, like, B-movie kind of horror, like schlocky film and game kind of experience, and this kind of gives that to you, right? It feels very much like an 80s zombie style film in a lot of ways, and a similar kind of B-movie video game as well in terms of like the graphics and everything, but there's so much charm and fun to it, I think. And I think Dying Light 2, maybe a little bit like the first one, I don't know, like my perception of that game is so warped by how much I loved it and immediately was struck by it. But like, I think so many people can be turned off by both the premise and also turned off by like just the physical look of the game. This one in particular, I think, doesn't look as impressive as the first one did in its time period, right? And like the context when it came out in. But if you kind of get underneath the hood of that, like there are moments of beauty, I think. There are moments that work, right? If you're able to kind of adapt to being like, this isn't photorealistic. It's just a good looking video game, right? It's nothing spectacular, but it's still above like a mediocre kind of visual experience. And then that same central core element of, 2 or 3 zombies is a threat, right? Especially early on where you aren't powerful enough and you are just using like pipes with like spikes in them and a broken off cricket bat, right? Like what they do there does feel so exciting and so engaging in terms of the combat and moment-to-moment gameplay. In terms of, I think one thing that I never talked about enough when I talked about how much I love Dying Light 1, but it's still present here, is I think I am learning that I really like video games that let me just wander and explore, right? And Horizon obviously does it. You can just wander off the beaten path and do nothing, but in a way where, yeah, like it still feels like you're accomplishing something and you still feel like you're discovering a new thing, right? Which people always talk about for Breath of the Wild, but I found really barren and empty. And so I think here in Dying Light or in Horizon, like, 1 or 2, right? Like, they have these moments of like just exploring the city you're in or exploring like the forest you're kind of wandering around. And I think just feeling the lived in world, right? And this one being set like 2 decades after the first one, things are even more kind of run down, but also built up in kind of a simultaneous way, right? Like they've established something here in a way that they hadn't really in the first one. And I find that super engaging and I find that really interesting. I think the biggest critiques I have of it really are that the protagonist is significantly less interesting than Crane was in the first game. And part of that, I think, is that Crane, you could, to a certain extent, just kind of map yourself onto, right? He was, I guess, in reality, fairly kind of just like, who are you? You're Crane, basically, kind of thing. Because you never saw his face, really, and it was just the legend of Crane as he kind of went through the game. And with Alden, I think, or Aiden, you have like a much more fleshed out character. The problem being that I find him totally bland and like whatever, and I love his backstory stuff, as we talked about, I think off mic, but the like kind of stuff that's happened in the past that are flashbacks you kind of experience as you go through the game don't really do anything for me. But the larger cast of characters around him are just fun, like goofy Dying Light caliber characters, right? That you got from the first game. And it's cool to see the little connections bleed through from Dying Light 1 to 2, right? And the references you got early on to like Crane from Spike, and the references you get to what's happened afterwards, and like the little newspaper clippings you'll see, or that kind of stuff, or the whispers of the world before, I found really interesting, because I feel like it's a really interestingly set time period for a zombie apocalypse game. In some ways, sort of like The Last of Us, where it is like, I feel like so often zombie stories are set right after zombie apocalypse, or they might go the opposite route and be like, it's like 100 years later and the world's just fucked. It's the apocalypse kind of thing. And I like the idea of like this like 20 years later time period where like most people don't really remember what the world was like before that, but there are people who do, right? Who have those memories either as kids or young adults, and the older people who've made it to be like senior citizens here now who can remember that world and do kind of tell these stories to kids, whether it's Ellie or in The Last of Us, or kind of the young kids you come across here who don't know what like a birthday party celebration looks like, where you're not huddled around like a fire and like a tent village thing is, or like what like a radio player is, right? Or what like a cassette tape is, right? And like these kind of small gestures that I think kind of flesh out how removed this world is. And Dying Light 2 has an extra added element of, I find, interest, because the rest of the world is operating as if this is basically just like a thing we don't talk about, right? So like it's sort of unique, both Dying Light 1 and 2, in that the rest of the world is fine, right? It's just this spot that is basically gone bananas. And so this idea that like, especially in Dying Light 2, like the outside world is just giving up helping them, right? And they're, you see like the newspaper clippings early on of like, the world is kind of reducing its aid to Haran after like 5-year mark, and are they just going to be forgotten, right? And like that idea and that theme being played with, and even that was kind of present in the first one, right? Of like this being like a third world country that like they can only give so much aid and support to. I really like that idea, and it's sort of unique in zombie stories. And then you get to the actual, I think, gameplay mechanics of the system, right? And the parkour and the running and all that works. And while I think it takes some time to get used to in terms of like the controls of a game in a 2022 video game world, once you do kind of wrap your head around them, they're super, I think, intuitive, and you kind of can work them really well. And it never gets old, just like sprinting and running and climbing and leaping off the tallest buildings in the city and having this kind of horde of either people or zombies kind of come after you. And that is always super engaging, even if the story beats don't hit, or even if the characters around you don't hit, you always have that to fall back on. That is really engaging.
How deep into the game are you? Because you talked about the idea that like, oh, the rest of the world outside Haran is fine, and my understanding of the sequel is that no, that's not the case. That like the virus did spread, and most of the world is devastated at this point. So I don't know if you're just like in Haran, and or if that just hasn't like been.
I definitely haven't gotten to that
yet?
beat yet in the story. Yeah,
Okay.
Then where they're still, because now they're still just like, certainly the characters that I've met haven't said that yet. So that'll be interesting to see how that'll be interesting to see how it plays into the idea that I think they were going for in terms of at least like the hours of the game I've put in, where it seems like they were kind of going for a larger theme of like the world ignored us, right, and kind of like turned their back on us. And so I'll be curious to see how that then feeds into larger video. Like not necessarily they just also all died or became zombies. No, but I mean, I like that element from Dying Light 1 then. But yeah, I mean, it's it's still doing cool, interesting things at times. The stories, I do think, and I think I told you this already. Like, I think it's less clever than the first one is in terms of its sense of humor, and I think in its understanding of zombie tropes and cliches, right? Whereas I think the first Dying Light was so special to me because I feel like the people who made that game had such an intricate understanding and love and knowledge of like zombie stories and cliches and stereotypes and like, you know, story beats and character arcs and all this kind of stuff, and then did really fun things in subverting those and flipping them on their head and delaying when those beats would hit and kind of keeping you as a zombie fan like I am kind of off on your toes constantly, and you can never really expect what was going to happen next because they knew that and kind of did interesting and fun things with it. I think this one goes a more traditional route in terms of a lot of those story beats and like zombie tropes, right? Which is still fine and good because, you know, they're still good, you know, zombie beats and kind of tropes are kind of going to again and again. But I do think that sense of kind of tongue-in-cheek nature and kind of being in on the joke almost of like what is happening in the world is missing a little bit from Dying Light 2. And really the sense of humor in general, I think, is fairly hit or miss. I think the jokes have a 50-50 success rate, I found, really. But that's also, I think, sort of what I would expect from this video game and this kind of video game in 2022. And so it kind of has its own charm in the like groany, like, oh, all right, lines that it tries to pull as well.
I mean, I wouldn't expect a game like Dying Light I wouldn't expect humor as like a central like I wouldn't expect it to be a comedy game or anything like that.
No.
So
yeah.
At least they're peppering in some kind of jokes to you know, have some levity in there. It's Horizon's the same way of like there are like, it's not, you know, laugh out loud uproarious stuff, but there have been a few interactions where I've gotten like a pretty good chuckle because of how either Aloy responds to somebody or how somebody responds to Aloy. There's definitely been a few moments where it's just been like, yeah, that's actually how a normal person would react. Because like, I mean, I'll just give one example of, you know, Aloy talks to somebody and then like, you know, taps her focus and starts kind of examining this thing that they've given her, and they can't see all of the glyphs and the like the augmented reality stuff that we, the player, and Aloy are seeing. And so they just kind of have this like moment where like two characters are just kind of like, should we call somebody? Is she okay? And it's just like, you got nice. Like there, and I think there's an element of it's used sparingly enough, or kind of those elements that like when it does come in, it's like, nice. I appreciate that they like that somebody thought to have that moment. Same in some of like the flashback writing and stuff like that or not flashback, but the you know, the data pads and stuff that you find around the world. Like there'll be fun little beats of like, you know, how a character responded to something else, or little jokes, or little anecdotes and stuff that you'll find around the world. It's like, oh, that was a cute little clever moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think Dying Light 2, I'm excited to see more of it. I'm excited to progress further. I'm excited to get to the kind of beats you talked about and see what its end game is really. I think the villains are all pretty generic, but it's a zombie story, right? That's to be expected. I mean, the villains in the first one were fun because they were living up zombie kind of baddie tropes to such a larger than life degree they made him engage in. And I think here we're largely getting villains who are supposed to not be larger than life, at least so far. And so I'll be kind of curious to see once we kind of get to the more engaging ones.
It's definitely one that I'm like, as more and more people talk about it, and as I saw and have seen a couple of kind of Cameron's Let's Play moments and stuff, like I'm more and more tempted to actually pick it up and give it a shot.
Do it, man.
Because
do it.
I think like
let's just co-op that ship together. Let's go.
It's not trying to be, you know, Resident Evil. It's not trying to have a scare for you around every corner or something like that.
I will say,
and like there's the power fantasy of you can drop kick these zombies off a building or something like that, and like that the enjoyment of that or something like that, like you having the power, I think is something interesting. But then at the same time, like, oh, like deprecated weapons, hate that. And scary things, I'm not a fan of those things. So like it's very much like the scales are pretty much even on, like, I'm interested in checking this out, but also like there are enough elements of the game that are keeping me away from it.
I will say that at least in my like 6 to 7 hours of game time, probably, I think this game is less scary than the first one is. I think and part of that might just be like the tone this game is striving for, right? And like the focus it's more intent on building, right? Like I think it's like scary zombie moments a lot in the first game kind of thing. But I think that, if you do stick to the day, it's like it can be like creepy stuff at times. You like navigate certain buildings, but it's never like I don't think like terrifying really ever. And then even like in the first like nighttime sequence you go in the game, which is like really the element you saw in Cameron's first Let's Play, even like the enemies there are not like spooky enemies. Basically, they're all like regular zombies and like one special one, and the one special one isn't even like the like famous one from the first game. It's like a new like toad looking like thing almost, and that's like more annoying than anything else in terms of like what it's doing with you. Like I think you can navigate the world of Dying Light 2 pretty well to avoid nighttime interactions if you don't want to do nighttime stuff, right? There'll be some side quests you probably can't do, but on the whole you'll be fine mostly, save for like the occasional main story beat where like it's going to make you either go to something nighttime or go to like a cave or tunnel where you're going to find creepy crawlers. But I think it is definitely way less of a horror experience than something like Resident Evil for sure. But even more than like Dying Light 1, I think it leans less into like the horror elements, at least so far, in my kind of experience with it.
Yeah, it might be something I pick up, depending on kind of how the year plays out. Like, I feel like the last couple summers have been pretty light in terms of like stuff for me to, like, I mean, I spent most of last summer revisiting and playing through Final Fantasy 14, putting 300 plus hours into that. So so maybe this will be something like, I'll grab it on sale during the summer or something, especially when like I will have been removed from the like long dive of an open world from Horizon into a similarly themed but first person open world dive of a Dying Light 2. And so maybe I'll sink my teeth into it later in the year.
I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts if you do that. Moving from Dying Light 2 to Bloodstone, like we mentioned at the top of the hour, I really wanted to play a James Bond video game, and it is surprisingly hard. Almost like there hasn't been a James Bond video game in 10 years at this point. An entire console generation went and came since we had 007 Legends in 2012 for the 50th anniversary. We're doing all this James Bond movie content, obviously, and I wanted to play really just a spy game in general, hence why I went through and played Hitman, and then why I played through all of Counter Spy and beat that again. It's great still, in case you were curious. But I wanted to do an actual Bond video game, so I went to Bloodstone. I think it's fun. I think it is a totally solid Bond video game experience. I think it is neither the best nor the worst James Bond video game. If you ask me to give it a rating, I'd probably say it's like a 7.5 out of 10. I think it's totally good.
And that's like on the I love Bond very much scale versus like the reviews around the world where I think a little more less than 7.5s.
Maybe, but I think even if I removed this outside of being a Bond game, I would still probably give it a similar rating, right? Like, it's very much of like the pre-Skyfall era of Daniel Craig Bond. There's no gun barrel sequence. There's the opening credits like don't happen until the end of the game. Like it very much is kind of leaning into, I think, the spirit of like Casino Royale, Quantum of Solace before we get to like Skyfall and Bond, maybe becoming like more classic Bond touches again. And so it definitely leans into that. I think, you know, the big kind of things that like 4 points I wrote down that I kind of wanted to go on over is that like it's a very weird game in the sense of the entire game you can probably beat in 8 hours. And even that may be generous, right? It is not a long video game by any means. And even still, it feels like there is more game than story here. Right? Like the game very clearly like reaches a climax and reaches kind of the end of the story you've been on for the first like 5 to 6 hours of it, basically. And then that ends, and all of the other characters in the video game are like, great job, Bond, you did it. Good job, Bond, you did it. Great job, you know, we're all finished up. And Bond is like, I think there's more here. And like goes off on like basically like the like mission 2.0, right? And you can't call it an epilogue because it's like a third of the game, and it's just kind of like, oh, there's like more, but like the main bad guy we've had for the entire first 2/3 of the game is dead now, and all like a lot of the main characters have like left, like the Bond girl's not in the last act at all until like the very end. And so like it's a weird like, oh well, we're making a video game but we only have like 5 hours of a game, so we're just gonna like add on this other act kind of thing to it. And it definitely has the feel of what's happening right now? Who's the villain? What are we doing? I think Bloodstone struggles with like the villain issue a lot, actually, like because you have a bad guy in like the pre-credit sequence of the game, or what would be the pre-credit sequence if there was a then credit sequence, but like it's kind of the open is like not related to the rest of the game part of the thing. And then you get to like the actual game proper, and you have like a bad guy you track down, and he kind of leads you to like a bigger bad who is then the big bad for like the rest of the first act and like all of the second act, basically. And then that ends, and you basically bounce through like 3 other guys where you get to like the actual final bad guy who you don't even know exist until the last like hour of the game, basically. And it's just like, this is a weird way to end this game structurally. It has an issue, again, I think partly from the time period it was made, where Quantum of Solace ends in the Bond series, as you'll see when we get there, and then Skyfall picks up. There was this like weird 4-year gap where like I feel like the Bond series didn't know what direction it necessarily wanted to go in terms of continuing with the Quantum storyline and where that left off, and that kind of version of Bond, or like doing something different with like another direction of the Daniel Craig era. And so this kind of like hedges its bet a little bit and like hints at like a larger organization that could be Quantum. But then if you like look at it through the lens of like what we get in Spectre and Ultimate Die, it could be like, oh, maybe they were hinting at Spectre and they just, you know, whatever, who knows? And so like it has a very unfortunate like cliffhanger ending that is never resolved, unless you'd be like, oh, like Spectre is like the follow-up to that. Don't worry about it. Which is sort of unfortunate, and I think it tries to kind of like hedge its bet on what direction James Bond might go next, and not knowing that Skyfall will kind of go in a different direction than where Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace did in like tone and storylines.
I feel like you were drastically overestimating how much they were actually trying to tie it into the cinematic stuff, because I mean, like that's not really the history of Bond games. Is like let's
but the Daniel Craig era
work.
I think is different a little bit, right? Like I think they went a different direction, like the Pierce Brosnan ones from the early 2000s.
I mean, maybe I knowing absolutely nothing about these games, obviously,
sure. Right?
Sure. I would expect like, apart from I've talked to you enough that I've looked enough of these games up on Wikipedia.
Nice.
And I would say that by and large, they're just kind of like, hey, we're doing a one-off standalone Bond story.
Mm-hmm.
with whatever bond we can get to answer our call and do the the likeness and VO for it.
Sure.
And like it's fine in that regard, but it's not trying to like say this is how these things secretly tie to Spectre or Quantum or whatever. Like it's just, hey, this is a standalone adventure with this particular bond, in the same way that I would compare it to all of the like audio Doctor Who things that exist out there.
Sure.
Of like
there's so many.
Those are just kind of like standalone one-off things that, like, sure, if you really wanted to try and figure out somewhere to put them into like the narrative of a Doctor,
the chronology,
you like, I'm sure they would be open to it, but they're not trying to say like this actually happens between this episode of the Matt Smith story and this other episode of the Matt Smith story.
I think that is an element. There is one. So there's a lot of truth in that, obviously. I do think though that one thing I will highlight about Bloodstone is that it is a original story, which I think are almost universally the best James Bond video games. Whether it is like the Agent Under Fire, Nightfire, Everything or Nothing kind of trio from the PS2 era to obviously Bloodstone here. I think you oftentimes get the best James Bond games when they can just do their own thing and not feel tied to a movie that they're almost never going to live up to. Just because of the way that video games are translated into, or movies are translated into video games, I should say. Plus,
I would say that the timeline typically, like the issue with so many of those licensing deals is like, okay, you're gonna make a game to line up with Casino Royale, so you have until this date to do it or something like that. And like with how games are done today, almost impossible. They somehow miraculously pulled it off with GoldenEye and stuff like that, but games were A lot simpler, and B, they probably crunched and burnt out absurdly crazy on something like that.
I mean, even GoldenEye came out after the movie.
But it
came out 2 years after the movie. Yeah, 97. That's what I thought.
Yeah, but it's still like they're doing the tie-in element to like, hey, we want to capitalize on the success of GoldenEye, so go make a GoldenEye game. And it was probably like, you have until, X blah, blah, blah date or whatever. I mean, it's the same with like the Spider-Man stuff, like the Spider-Man games that weren't beholden to like Tobey Maguire and stuff were going to be a very different flavor than the ones that were.
I think you see that most noticeably for me in the Quantum of Solace video game, which is the Quantum of Solace video game in the same way that I'm basically an NBA player because I'm 6 feet tall, right? It's a video game that basically sets off with like the opening mission of Quantum of Solace. Then you do like an hour of that basically, and then James flashes back to Casino Royale's movie, and you play through basically all of Casino Royale, and then you get to like the last mission of Quantum of Solace because it came out the same year as Quantum. And so I'm sure in that movie that is famously plagued behind the scenes in terms of its production, they had no idea what the fuck the story was going to be. So they were like, well, we know what the beginning of it's going to be. We know what the end's going to be. So we're just going to shove in a whole other movie in between to fill out a video game, right? So you have these weird things where like that happens. And like Bloodstone doesn't have those issues, obviously, which makes it nice. I do think the like combat of it is really great. I find that it is a video game that understands the like switch from shooting to like hand-to-hand combat really well and does it in a really fun way that doesn't make it a pain in the ass to do it, unlike some games of this era. And then I find it to be a really engaging Bond story for most of it, right? Like, it is by no means the best of the best, and it's not like particularly like over the top and large in life and fun in a way that like Nightfire, Agent Under Fire, like Everything or Nothing is from the PS2 era. But like, definitely I'd rather play this again than watch like The Man with the Golden Gun. So that's something. And I think that the weirdest thing for me is the Bond girl, who is Josh Stone, who's like a British female musician, basically, who also did like the music. Her character is super bizarre, and has like really weird Bond lines that would have fit in like a 1970s Bond movie, but not here, right? Like where like she'll talk about how like she feels safer when a man drives, and like, you know, Bond starts like describing his plan. She goes like, whoa, 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 like slow down, you're going too fast for me, kind of stuff, and like all these like weird things. And it's like the Daniel Craig era, like the game people in this game, like the Daniel Craig era never really had their Bond girls do anything remotely like that. Even like the Pierce Brosnan ones didn't really. So it's sort of like a weird like throwback to like, oh, this is like a whole Bond girl from like 3 decades earlier.
So
it's kind of like jarring.
It's the misogyny of Bond mixing with the misogyny of video games.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, like
Joy.
They, like, yeah, they were like the Daniel Craig series has moved past, and the game makers were like, not on our watch. And it's like such a weird thing, and like every time almost that like she will start talking, it's like, sure, like we're having like an engaging back and forth, and they're always just like weird throw in lines there, and it's like, whoa, okay, that was like a weird like drop in at the end, and it's not made better by the fact that her whole like other life when she's not like on a spy mission is like she's a fashion designer and just like a socialite, and so like that is her personality. She's not someone who is like a spy in their day job. She's just like, I make jewelry is what I do, right? And she makes like a very weird point that is like maybe the one that like most rolled my eyes at, where she was like, you know, here's a drink for you, like a vodka martini dry, I know how you like it like that. And then he's like, oh sure, whatever, thanks, I guess, I don't care. He's Daniel Craig, he doesn't give a shit about that stuff. And then she's like, yeah, I get the same thing because I don't like girly drinks, and like really emphasizes it. And it's like, what a weird like step back we're taking for feminism here, Joss Stone's character. And so that was always bizarre. But yeah, I mean, I think Bloodstone is a fun game. It definitely has me excited to play what will probably be a significantly better Bond game with Project 007, with like IO Interactive whenever we get that. But it scratched the itch I had of like, I want to do something with like Bond and a spy. It very much again is like of the pre-Skyfall run where like Bond doesn't have any gadgets, which is kind of annoying at time. He just has like a cell phone that is a gadget in every other word but a gadget. So that's kind of dumb, but he can't have anything fun yet. And then like the last big note I had is that like I think the game is like pretty straightforward. It's like pretty simple in terms of like its difficulty. Like there are moments where they'll throw like a lot of enemies at you, but the game gives you like a focus shot ability that you can kind of earn from like doing stealth takedowns or like cool shit like that, where you can basically like Red Dead freeze time and like shoot like 2 or 3 enemies at a time to like take them out. And that is super engaging and so much fun constantly, and like makes you feel like James Bond, I think, in a really cool way. But the like flip side of that difficulty is the game also has like the patented Bond car chase missions spread throughout the video game that are so much harder than the rest of the game. Like easily the hardest part of the game are just the car chases, and it's maybe compounded by the fact that, you know, in Nightfire or Everything or Nothing, we're in the Pierce Brosnan era, so we have missiles and oil slicks and like all this crazy gadgets in the car. In the Daniel Craig era, we don't, and so it is just like you chasing after someone, and there's nothing you can do to make yourself go faster or make them go slower. And the game does a very, I think, 2010 thing of like, it'll like have like a fucking like bus suddenly like come in the way to like slow you down and like throw you off course, or to block off the other avenue so you can't get lost. But what it ends up doing more often than not is like the shit that blocks the side roads for me not to go into comes too quickly or too suddenly and just fucking hits me. And the game's like meter for you are now too far away from this car is so sensitive. Like basically, if you make a mistake, more often than not, the game's gonna be like, oh, the car got away. You failed the mission. Which is like fine, except for the car missions are routinely like 5 minutes long. And so they have checkpoints spread throughout them, which makes it somewhat better. But like it can definitely be a slog through some of them. And definitely by like the last one, which is like the last mission of the game, is a car chase scene, I was definitely ready for them to not be there anymore. especially because like you never get to do anything other than just like chase this person through this area in a sports car, and if you get too close, we're gonna Mario Kart it basically, and they're gonna get like a speed boost to get further away from you, kind of thing. But yeah, it's fun. Again, I think it's a solid 7.5. It's scratchy itch I kind of had, and it was kind of a nice palate cleanse in between kind of dives into Dying Light 2.
Is this one you had played before?
I had never played. This is one of the only Bond games I had never played before. Yeah, and I liked it. Again, I would say it's probably like parallel with like Agent Under Fire from like the PS2 run, which I think is like the weakest of those three. And like below like Nightfire, Everything or Nothing, GoldenEye, and probably on the same peg as like Agent Under Fire, and like maybe below From Russia with Love, just for like the novelty of that video game of like getting Connery back. But it is still solid. It is leaps and bounds better than like Tomorrow Never Dies, War Is Not Enough, GoldenEye, fucking Rogue Agent. So you know, it's kind of a nice like mid-tier Bond game, I think.
Okay. Well, we've spent too much time on this episode talking about Bond. We spent more time on Bond than we spent on Dying Light 2 or Horizon Forbidden West, the games that people will ever actually play. Only on your show, Logan. Thank you.
Otherwise, Trevor, do you have any shout outs you want to give this week?
I do. I want to give a shout out to an article from gamesindustry.biz. The article is titled "Lessons Learned from the Success of Spiritfarer." It's actually is a little over a week old, but it came out basically like after we recorded last week's episode. It's basically like the team behind Spiritfarer, which was one of my favorite games of 2020, kind of talking about, you know, the what they learned from the game, from like the announcement of it to like the reception of it to even kind of changing elements of the game after the fact, after kind of taking in some criticism and feedback from like communities like Able Gamers and stuff like that, of like, hey, you've got a little bit of like ableist language in this game, could you consider like, oh, and then basically being like, oh, that was not our intent, let's figure out how we can kind of remedy that situation and make this the game that we want it to be for people. And in particular, they talk about the idea that like they were amazed by kind of the community response to it in terms of things that the other thing I will link is my own piece from the game, how Spiritfarer helped me say goodbye, which I wrote kind of as a response to an element from the game of that happened. I played this game, you know, a handful of months after my grandmother passed. My grandmother, who had suffered from like kind of like Alzheimer's or her mental faculties had severely diminished in her later in life, and there was a character in the game that does not, you know, has a hard time remembering who you are and stuff, but she has these moments of lucidity. And they talked about how therapeutic the game ended up being for a lot of people, myself included, in like kind of helping people kind of cope and deal with some of that loss and that tragedy. And especially like obviously 2020, this game came out in the middle of the pandemic, or like early on in the pandemic, so a lot of people were probably, you know, facing some kind of loss in that regard. So just a really cool thing. And you know, anytime I can shout out Spiritfarer, I will shout out Spiritfarer. So shout out to this article from I want to get there from Colin Campbell over at gamesindustry.biz.
Absolutely. I cannot echo all of that enough. Spiritfarer is one of the games I should really get around to at some point, because I'm sure I will really enjoy my time with it.
You as you were talking through your Bond stuff, I'm like, you really sat down and played this instead of True Colors, Life is Strange True Colors, which I told you to play for 6 months now. Yeah. Thanks, Logan. So glad you can fit time for a PS3 Bond game.
Yeah. It's a great shout out. And we will definitely include that in the show notes, as well as Trevor's really, really good piece on Spiritfarer as well. That is one of my favorite things you've probably written for the site. Otherwise, that is the show. I hope you like what you heard. If you did, you can go over to youtube.com/thatnerdysite, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the little bell notification to go get notified when a new video goes live, which is basically every single day of the week. We've got new content going live Monday through Saturday on YouTube. Actually, now that I think about it, that's crazy. You can also go over to thatnerdysite.com, check out all the latest podcast reviews, features going live over there, as well as the podcast service of your choice, where you can make sure to like and subscribe to the podcast there, as well as rate and reviewing us on iTunes, giving us the 5 stars, and telling us why you love us so much. Otherwise, you can go find Trevor at Trevor J. Starkey on the internet. Trevor, anything that you want to plug?
In honor of at least 2 of, I guess in honor of all 3 topics, we'll go with, I did put up my first, the first chunk of Horizon Forbidden West. I did my gameplay of that as That Nerdy Site Plays.
It was like a special Saturday thing, right?
Sunday, I think, is when I put that. I basically had that
7
scheduled.
days a week.
Exactly. Like it was like, well, we've got a gap on Sunday. I'll throw this up as an extra bonus episode on Sunday. So you can go catch that on YouTube. You can catch Cameron's Dying Light 2 series, Friday Night Dying Light, every Friday night on YouTube. He's up to episode 3, so episode 4 will go live this week as he plays through Dying Light 2. And then That Bond Show, our Saturday podcast that you can catch. We're up through Live and Let Die. So we are, that's what, like 40% of the way through Bond stuff?
Live and Let Die would be a little bit less than that, because we're not halfway yet where we are on actual recorded episodes yet.
Like we... What
we did an 11 out of 25.
Live and Let Die was, yeah. Sorry,
Number 8.
I was thinking like we've passed the 40%
sure,
part on what we recorded. Yes, yeah. Live and Let Die was like a third of the way through. Whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. That's almost exactly a third. So go check out all of those. They're all great. Shoutouts. You can go find me at LeftyLogie at LeftyLogie on the internet. LOGGY. I will echo all of those. Those are all excellent shoutouts. I will also give a shout out to That D Plus Show. Lots of fun stuff happening there. It seems like we might potentially have a 4-person D Plus show, at least a 3-person one, it seems like this week, for Free Guy.
Yes.
Perfect. Nailed it. Haven't seen the movie yet, but Free Guy, which is going to be dropping on Disney Plus on Wednesday. And so we will go over that for Friday's episode this week. I'm really excited about it. Trevor once told me that since I loved Jumanji so much, the rock version, I would really like Free Guy, and I'm excited to see that hold true. Or at the very least, just see Ryan Reynolds be Ryan Reynolds for 2 hours. Otherwise, you can go check out That Nerdy Site at That Nerdy Site all across the internet. For myself, for Trevor, and for all of us here at That News You Care About, play your games and be good to each other.